Downloading. Program activated.
Comfort is a drug. Comfort is a really addictive drug.
Thank you for downloading the Fitbox Fizzy Cool podcast. In this episode, my guest is Mr. Tom Wheelhouse. I hope you enjoy our conversation.
My actual background really was languages. So you're probably already thinking, how does that possibly translate into joining the police in London? But I think it does, just because I was kind of curious about the world and I wanted to meet people and talk to people and solve problems, and just had a sort of curious mindset about it. So I found myself very much in that post-university. I'm sort of 20, 21, don't know what to do with my life, probably feel like I should get a proper job in inverted commas. I was working in London, freelance English teaching and temporary English teaching. I just saw the advert in the Evening Standard on the train home and I just thought, you know what, that actually looks pretty interesting to join the Met. I'll put in for it and see what happens, kind of thing.
You weren't proactively looking for things, trying to decide what direction to go in. You just knew that you wanted to do something that wasn't what you were doing, and then literally saw an advert and
and it was as much of a whim as that. I just thought, that looks all right. I'll put in for it and see what happens. And, it took a long time. It was probably an 18-month process all in of kind of increasingly complicated stages.
But how long before when you say process, that the process of filling out a form or replying to an email and then being a police officer, or it took you 18 months to think, right, I'm going to do this?
Probably took me about 18 minutes to think I'm going to do this
really?
on a whim. But yeah, from filling in the form to, walking in the door in my uniform on the first day, probably about 18 months of application centres, vetting and all the rest of it. I did have time to think about it, and I just think, it wasn't a lot else on my kind of plate. I was up for it.
Is that on purpose, that time frame, to kind of, is it like a filtering system to weed out those that are serious from those that are not, or just not that well run a machine?
I was going to say, I'd love to think there's that much kind of coordination and thought gone into it, but I think it's just the admin. I think it's the bureaucracy of it, and I imagine it's like herding cats probably. At that point, that was 2008. They would bring in so many people in such big intakes. They probably had so many people to try and coordinate, and it seems weird now in the current climate, but we actually had to go and physically all be in big lecture rooms and groups and all that kind of stuff. So I think it's just the wheel turns very slowly, and actually to this day there are people who can apply and then not start until 3 years later sometimes, which is bonkers. I don't think any kind of healthy recruitment plan would do that on purpose. There's definitely an element as well, I think, where they want there to be enough stages to think actually you got to want this, and
you did clearly wanted it properly. But is it absolutely the case that before then it just hadn't been on the radar? I mean, I mentioned prior to recording that I'd wanted to be a police officer as a little boy, and how I was patrolling my street in my uniform on my bike. But I also grew up watching things like TJ Hooker, The Bill. There wasn't we didn't have the Avengers everywhere to look at. The police were the superheroes as far as I was concerned when I was younger. So that wasn't the case for you at all?
I'd watched The Bill and all that stuff as well. And you're right, definitely the things that probably seem pretty kind of boring now were exciting. There were bits of it that definitely really appealed. I wanted to do the sort of more internationally looking stuff. So it's hard not to kind of be interested in doing the Gucci stuff with all the kit and screaming around, and all that stuff's appealing. I definitely hadn't kind of ever thought, I would never have ticked a box at school saying, I want to join the police as a career choice. It was something that kind of evolved.
So when you saw that advert and you thought, all right, that's something that could be a bit of me, did you allow yourself to picture or conjure up how that might look in a year, 2 years, 10 years from now? Did you see yourself as Columbo in the Raymax solving crimes like that, or kitted up with the fast ropes and the helmet and the goggles and storming buildings and whatnot that are under siege? Did you think in that much detail at all about where you might go?
I think I knew that I wanted to kind of explore a lot of it and do all the things that were available. So my justification for joining the Met rather than one of the sort of surrounding forces was just that there's obviously a much bigger place, much more going on, much more opportunity in that sense. So although I didn't know exactly where I wanted to go, that was on my mind. And actually one bit that I did have in mind as a sort of longer term goal was, because I'd done my year abroad of my degree in Lyon in France, which is the sort of headquarters of Interpol. So I was really interested in that whole kind of international law enforcement stuff, and I'd done the languages, and I thought eventually that's the ultimate kind of goal, is to go and do that. And it all kind of seems interesting, doesn't it, that stuff, when you think about it? It's like you say, it's the kind of thing you do see in TV programs, and it all feels a bit kind of Mission Impossible or something. So I think that was a kind of loose end goal. But I didn't go home every night thinking, oh, right, yeah, this is what I need to do to get on a firearms team or anything like that. I was just kind of, I'm going to throw myself into this and see where it leads.
Just to ride the wave, really.
Yeah, exactly.
So you're in, and did you say this was around 2008?
Early 2009, I ended up actually joining, yeah.
Okay, and is it then the case that you're at the police academy or the equivalent for a period of time?
Not quite like the Films Police Academy.
No, I'd hope not.
Not actually as far away as you might imagine. But
so what's that process like? You talked about classrooms and people being in the same place. How different was that to classrooms? Obviously, you'd not long left university, but how different is that classroom and that learning experience?
I think at the time it was going through a real change from what had previously been very much a discipline service. That's something you sort of hear probably less now in the police. It's a discipline service, but we did still have things like parades and we did drill. So, we were pretty rubbish at it, but we did, marching and your boots inspected and, uniform that was a real thing, professional standards. So there was almost like a sort of semi-military element to that, which was obviously totally different to being a university student. But I think it was also just going through that stage of softening a little bit into being also, this is a classroom environment and there's almost an element more where it's tutoring and coaching rather than you're being kind of drilled, and it's an interesting mix of the two. And I had no issues with the kind of academic side because I've done a lot of that, but it was almost what you would imagine, like you say, as a sort of police academy, like you would imagine, versus actually a training environment much more akin to like you would get in any other industry.
What role did physicality have in the education process? I suppose there's an element of discipline there, of cohesion, of teamwork, and maybe there'll be occasions where you have to, present yourselves at, for the public or dignitaries or whatnot. But was there an element of physical training? And what did you think of that, and how was that important?
I mean, for me personally, I would say I don't think there was enough. I think, again, if you asked 10 different police officers from sort of 10 different generations or 10 different stages over the last 30, 40 years, you'd get very different answers on that. And you'd see how the physicality has probably ebbed away a little bit almost with the discipline side as well. I think those two are very tied together. When I was at Hendon, there was still a running track, the swimming pool had gone, but all that kind of stuff was just on the way out. There wasn't really a culture of fitness or physicality being part of it. And I think, it's a massive contentious issue within policing. There's a basic job-related fitness standard, which is, in my personal opinion, not much of a standard, but a lot of it became around personal responsibility. And, I was already interested in fitness, and I certainly didn't find the initial fitness testing process difficult. And I don't think it was something I really had to train for, other than the fact that I wanted to train because I was training myself, because to me that was part of the sort of personal pride and discipline of turning up and being ready for the job. But I think actually there was very, very little emphasis or provision. Physicality is a big part of this job. And I understand why. That's not me trying to disparage the system at all. I understand how difficult that is, and there's so many other considerations to that. But I think it was actually played a smaller part than I thought it would.
Was it formal in any way? Was there a point during the day or during the week where everyone was taken through a workout, or even just a time allocated for, right, it's now a gym session or a run?
Only really as part of the process. So there were obviously certain things you had to kind of tick off or pass, or if we were doing something that was more skill based. So if we were doing self-defense type stuff, then there would be maybe a circuit in there somewhere. Or that was, I think, because the instructors, I think absolutely did want there to be more emphasis on the physicality, but that was the only way they had to fit it into the schedule, almost, was to shoehorn that into, well, we're going to make it a warm-up or something like that. And I think actually it wasn't really until later on in my career, which I'm sure we'll come to, when I was doing sort of specialist things, that those kind of elements of unit-based circuits, team training, that being built into the day, that kind of stuff really became a key pillar of the day. Before that, it was, we're all kind of on a conveyor belt, you've got to get through these things, and there was stuff there, there's a gym there and you can go and do your stuff, but it wasn't really a core part of the day, and it certainly wasn't on a par with how much time we're going to spend learning the Fraud Act.
And as you mentioned earlier on, you saw it as your personal responsibility to go and use that gym. You weren't put off going, obviously, but it wasn't encouraged to a significant enough level that people really embraced that. And I'm completely outside the job of being a police officer and their experience, and I do understand that there are diverse roles within the police, and some are very physical and some are very not. But I love that phrase, that culture of physicality, and that's something we're really keen to promote. But without that, it's not about chasing villains down the street. I understand that's not the role of every police officer, but the fitter you are, the healthier you are, the less time off you're going to have, the better you're going to recover, from stressful experiences, better you can cope with the day-to-day challenges that life or the job can bring. It seems short-sighted to not consider it as a more significant component.
100%. And I think, I'm going to go off on one here, but I think, yeah, you're absolutely right. There's two halves to it. There's two halves to every story, and there's the personal responsibility. And I always saw that as somebody's going to call the police, and I'm going to turn up, and they're going to want me to sort out whatever their problem is. And if that involves, climbing a fence or run 100 yards after somebody or fighting somebody who doesn't want to come in, then that's what I need to be able to do. So, I saw that as part of my duty almost, or personal pride. But I think on the flip side, you're right, not everybody wants to do those specialist roles, and there are people there with skill sets that I would never have had, who probably weren't ever going to be kind of wanting to do the running and jumping and chasing stuff, but they would be excellent at any other element, which is just as crucial. But like you say, good decision making is important in every part of policing, and you make better decisions when you're healthier. Your brain functions better, so it works all the way through. The sort of elephant in the room has always been that there's not been a real investment in creating an environment that encourages physicality or fitness. And I mean, physical and mental fitness, because even in the time since I first started, things like organised team sport in the police kind of has dropped away. And there's kind of smouldering embers of it still in places. But even when I started, that was a thing almost like the military, where there would be various football teams, basketball teams, boxing teams, and it was encouraged, and you could take time out of your duties to do it. There were facilities, the first station I worked at had a gym in the basement. That then went away. All the other components that come with that, sleeping. I think sometimes there's a perception in the outside world that, it's great because if you lay off or something, you can sleep at the police station. Well, you can't, because we don't have any beds or anything. And even when I worked later on a unit where it was absolutely normal to sleep at work, there was a few kind of camp beds with some office dividers in an old unused office. It wasn't, any kind of facility that you would expect to see performance people. And even nutrition, obviously, going through the sort of absolute basic fundamentals of a performing person. We had a vending machine with some chocolate bars in it. And that was it. So, things like canteens used to go away, all in the name of saving money in the short term. But I think it just underlines that physical performance as well as mental performance in policing for too long has been something that too many people in positions of power, they know the cost of it, but not the value. And I think that's the real frustration for people who are out there doing it.
And ultimately, is that how you perceive it as being judged? It is the cost. This costs money. We're going to have to say goodbye to that and redirect it somewhere else.
When actually that cost is only going to come back, 10 times over in the industry further down the line, because those people are going to get injured more. They're going to be off more with debilitating conditions. They already know all the statistics are there. They're going to suffer with poor mental health, and they won't be available. And not only will they not be available to the organisation as a resource, and I hate that. And I hated when that term started to creep in, that we started talking about people as resources rather than people. But also, they aren't available to the general public, which is the whole point of being there. And that's my kind of, I talk about it in a lot of my work, about seeing the emergency services as a performance environment, just as much as Owen Farrell steps up to take a kick. That's his moment, right? That's what he's there for, and you want him to have everything at his disposal to get that kick between the posts. Well, when you ring 999, you want a paramedic or a police officer to turn up who's been absolutely prepared and rested and trained and fit to answer your call. And I think that's the culture shift I kind of want to see, and what we're advocating for is actually look at these people as performance athletes almost. And there's so much stuff out there
and that ought to be.
Wigan eating donuts and stuff, where people laugh at the idea of a police officer being a performance athlete. But that's what we're asking them to do. We're asking them to perform in a very difficult arena, but not giving them the actual kind of preparation and tools to do it.
That is a reasonable expectation from an employee, but also from the public, that we would reasonably expect the emergency services, because there is more to it than just the police. But if they're going to turn up, that they're going to be able to perform at the highest possible standard, not just for us, but so that they can then go and do that again when needed for somebody else.
And absolutely. And I think, when I was first in my sort of basic police training, I remember one of the tutors saying, and I'll never forget, the worst possible thing that can happen here is you turn up somewhere when the police is called 999 and they look at you on their doorstep and they think, I'm all right, thanks. and that always kind of stuck with me. And that's about it, being ready and being ready to go, like in any other sport. And you and I know from playing basketball, it's when you're sat on the bench and the coach shouts your name that you're in. Are you ready to go? And are you actually the best you can be to answer that call? And like you say, that's not an unreasonable thing for everybody in that dynamic to expect.
No, and I think it's a great analogy to sport. I do think sometimes some of the language is unfortunate. I actually quite like the phrase, but it's not a useful one. I quite like the phrase that has come about in the last handful of years, or maybe it's been around longer, but not in the public domain, of the tactical athlete.
Yeah.
And certainly in in areas of the military, and it does seem to be, I'm not an expert in this area at all, but when I look at studies and research, it does seem to be the US are big on this on an emergency services level, that some areas of the police and the fire service take that tactical athlete thing very seriously. It is about performance, about being able to perform and do your job. However, where I feel it's unfortunate is it does sort of define only those in particular roles, and it'd be nice if there was another phrase. I don't know what it is, maybe that culture of fitness, there's tactical performance fitness, but then just general operational fitness, because you're absolutely right to liken it, I think, as a bench, as a team, and they're being deployed as and when the coach or the supervisor or the commander, the general, whoever that may be, sees fit or is required, and they need to get on and perform.
You're absolutely right. I think that you're spot on the tactical athlete stuff, and I really like that. But I think, it does run the risk of alienating some people, because it runs the risk of being seen as that. You get your sort of firearms team with that tactical, as well as being tactical, with all the all the gear and the shades and the biceps, and and that puts people off. There's a lot of people who aspire to do that, and it's great. And I've got a lot of good friends who'll be kind of probably messaging me about it. I think that's a dig at them, and it's not. But there are a lot of other people who'll think, well, actually, it's not policing. It's not just about that, and of course it isn't. And I think that's where I like that sort of analogy of almost like to me it's almost more like an American football team, where you've got like your different rosters, and you've got your offense and your defense, and you've got your kickers, and you've got people with different roles, but actually you need all of them.
Because each of those roles is important.
Absolutely.
And
the quarterback gets all the the advertising deals and is on the front cover.
He can't do it on his own,
most of it, but he can't. He's not kicking the goals. He's not doing the tackles. He's not. I'm not an American football expert, so I'll leave my technical knowledge of it there. But you need all those people with different skills and complementary skill sets. They all need to have the right kit and the right stuff, and they all need to perform in a different way. It's interesting, kind of loop back to what we were saying earlier about the physicality in basic training. What hasn't happened is separating that fitness is about being a big fellow who can handle themselves in a public order environment, and that stuff being performance, and performance not being something different to each person and equally important. And I think it's not really anyone's fault, but I think that's the evolution that something like policing is trying to go through, to say, well, actually we've got these roots that are really deeply embedded in service. And obviously there was a time not that long ago where you had to be over a certain height and male and all that thing. Thankfully that's not the case anymore.
No, having those physical standards is probably inappropriate. But what's interesting is that there are great synergies in what you're saying with the fitness industry, and how we show the public that actually this is what, if you Google or use any search engine, fitness and click on images, what you will see is a very specific image of what we're telling people fitness is, which is going to be, a young, hard, tanned, sweaty body, and somebody may be lifting something very, very heavy or running very, very fast. It's that elite level. And actually there's a continuum of fitness, and you can be as fit as you need to be to do the thing you need to do, and you are fit enough, but you have to be on the continuum. You can't dismiss it altogether just because you realize you don't need to be at that elite end.
I think that's a really important point, and I totally agree. And I think over the Christmas holidays, it's always world's strongest man time, isn't it? And not many people would look at some of those guys, and I think they're incredible, and it's absolutely superhuman, but they're not probably going to be on the cover of whatever the magazine is, because they haven't got 12 packs. But they're fit for what they're trying to be fit for, fit for purpose. So that's there. And the other thing I was just going to say as well is you hit the nail on the head about the continuum, because if I posted something on Twitter about job-related fitness tests in the police, I guarantee you it would kick off into all kinds of polarised debate, because there'll be some people who say that everyone should be kind of, getting to level 15 on the bleep test. And if you're not, then you don't want it enough and you're no good to us and all that kind of nonsense. And on the flip side, you'll have somebody saying, well, actually it's unfair. Everyone should be able to get a chance. And why should there even be a test and all the rest of it? And of course, the answer is somewhere in the middle. Just like you said, in the fitness industry, you don't have to be a PT with abs to be a valuable PT. But at the same time, you probably should have some kind of commitment and authenticity to health and fitness in general. And I think we suffer from being in a world where kind of Instagram rules say that if it's not immediately obvious, then it can't be subtle, it can't be nuanced, and I think that's really difficult. So how do you build that into an organizational culture where you do have to bring all those people in? You say that.
How do you build it in? You build it in at the beginning, don't you? And I think that's why I had interest in what goes on during the academy. Before I hit record, we had a joke about the fact that you were already waiting to go today, and how it's because it's been conditioned into you. That's not the phrase, is it? But it's been drilled into you, programmed into you to turn up early and to be prepared and have your pen and paper ready. And had physicality been drilled into the same degree, then perhaps that would have lasted as well. And I know with you that's not an issue because you have a personal interest and you're happy to take that personal responsibility on yourself. But for others, that was the time to instill it and to create that culture. You can't backdate it, can you? It has to be there at the beginning.
Exactly. And I think that's where, and I think that the popularity of some of those programs like the SAS programs and things that are on TV, sometimes when you see people going through those being really kind of broken down, being told, the standard is the standard and you got to make it there. A lot of people would argue that's what's being lost along the way, is there being a standard of physicality as well, alongside everything else in the job, operationally and technically. And actually, if you don't meet the standard, then you don't meet the standard and it's not for you. And that's okay too. I think we sometimes can shy away from that now when, and I'm as big an advocate for inclusion on every level as anyone else, because I think, a diverse team is a productive team. But sometimes there is a standard for certain things, and I don't think we should shy away from saying, look, actually, this role requires this, mentally, physically, emotionally, whatever, and we're going to obviously equip people to get there and support them to get there however we can. But if that's not the role for you, that's not the role for you. Just the same as, again, come back to the sports analogy, you wouldn't suddenly put the prop forward at fullback because they're totally different skill sets. They're both professional rugby players, but you wouldn't do that because you want different things from them, and they're not going to reach that standard, however good they are at their own role.
No, I like that. Yeah, I do like that, and it makes sense, doesn't it? I mean, ultimately, you put a team together to be successful, and that team can only be successful if it has all of the components that it needs. All of them different, all of them valid, but all different. You did end up, Tom, in an area of the police that was more physical, which was I hope I got the initials right because I've done some work with them before. It is the TSG, isn't it?
That's right. Yeah.
Okay. I think wrongly refer to them as the riot police. I don't know if that's the politically correct way to talk about them, but I did some work with them years ago, delivering fitness qualifications at a particular centre in London. And what you were saying earlier on about some of these stations being run down, not having the facilities, really rung true, because they had a nice big sports hall with a little bit of equipment in the corner, but there wasn't much going on in there. And this place, had not been cleaned for at least 400 years.
Sounds familiar.
Yeah, it was, I was crammed into a classroom with what felt like 50, 100 very serious looking people, looking at me to talk to them about fitness. And yet what they were all doing, because I think this would have been quite new at the time, was CrossFit. Mm-hmm. And I'm not a particularly pro or anti-CrossFit, but I certainly felt and feel that CrossFit in its raw form was not appropriate for what they were doing. And they were all of them, as they warmed up, it took a few days for them to talk to me. As they warmed up, they were all making very clear how they were, they had injuries and they were suffering from this, that and the other. And it kind of made sense. But although they were all absolutely committed, they absolutely had that personal responsibility. They were a really impressive group of people, but they didn't seem to have any inbuilt support or structures or programs to follow to get to enable them to be the best they could be, both individually and as a group.
I think you're absolutely right. And, you were just describing where I worked, really, I think. And I know, there's lots of them, so it's not necessarily the same one, but it all resonates. And it's just it's that wider picture. You couldn't find a group of people who were more personally responsible, more invested, and, all doing it off their own bat. Certainly when we did circuits and things, it was people who'd gone and done their PT qualifications, and they weren't getting paid extra for it or anything. They were doing it because they believed in it and they wanted the team to be as fit as we could, and, they wanted to support each other. But it's building on sand, really, isn't it? When but you've not got any chance to actually eat properly. You've not got a chance to rest properly. People are all carrying injuries and niggles and things, and not sleeping properly. You work in a shift pattern that's absolutely not conducive to health on any level, and that's a whole different issue. But shift work is absolutely proven to be really bad for you. That stuff's all out in the open, and it's not news to anyone that not sleeping, not eating, and working odd hours is really bad for you. So where's the kind of organizational responsibility? Because we talked a lot about personal responsibility, and this ties into a lot of the work we do in general. These people are making it work off their own goodwill, and there comes a point where goodwill runs out. And where's the sort of other half of that contract that says, actually, we're asking you to do a really difficult job and you're going out of your way to make it work, but we're not going to give you something to eat when you need it, or we're not going to give you a decent bed to sleep on when you need it, or
which makes it unsustainable.
Exactly. And that's what burns people out and breaks people like me. And
I was going to say, so that brings us on to the fact that you're not currently a serving police officer. There was a moment where decided that this isn't right, and obviously I can hear frustration in some of your descriptions of your experience. But you're in long enough that you also must have loved what you were doing, I've no doubt. But what led to the decision to leave, and what was that process like?
No, you're absolutely right. I think it's kind of clear to say that the frustration and the kind of almost anger comes from. I know there's, even right now we're talking, and there'll be people across the country who are knackered, burnt out, stressed, exhausted, but they're making it work, and they're keeping the wheels turning because they have to, and they see that as their own vocation. So it's just on behalf of them, really. But no, you're right, and I did love it, and I don't harbour any kind of bitterness about it. Don't have any regrets. I enjoyed it. I did a lot of things I would otherwise not have done, and it was brilliant. I got friends for life from it, and was able to make a contribution to society. So I'm proud of it. But there comes a point, and there certainly came a point for me, where that tank of goodwill is empty, and you can't refill it quick enough. And really, it was a gradual erosion of the positives, which sounds kind of dramatic and over the top, but it's small things. And this kind of strays into the employee engagement and recruitment and retention and all that side of it, which I do a lot of work on. But people in not just the police, but in education, in the health service, in the military, in the prison service, all over those kind of roles, you almost don't need to kind of G them up or motivate them to be there, because let's face it, nobody joins those jobs for the sort of fame and fortune or the glamour. People are doing it because they want to be there. So really, it should be straightforward to give them an environment that allows them to do that. But I think what we saw was just the erosion of that environment over time. It's little things like being able to actually sit down with your whole team in a canteen and talk things through and have a kind of a rapport and a team build, when there's so few of you to actually do the work. That's
something that is fundamental, isn't it, to relationship building, is allowing that outside of, whether it be outside the classroom, outside the gym, outside of work, that the ability to sit down and just talk rubbish, take the mick out of each other, share experiences, stories. That seems fundamental.
It absolutely is. And again, it's one of those things that was sold off quickly as a quick win, and that was almost an external political thing, because there was a phase a few years ago where the government basically, well, that's canteen culture, and meant as a negative term, that they're all kind of sitting around. And of course there are examples of that, like there are in every workplace, and I abhor those as much as everyone else, but it became seen as a thing, well, they're sitting around and kind of not doing much. When actually, like you say, that's the fundamental cornerstone of any team, is having each other's backs and believing each other and knowing each other. And we got to a stage where you couldn't get out the door quick enough, really, because there's so many calls outstanding and so many things to do that you wouldn't see each other for a coffee before the shift or after. And you all finish at different times as well, because you don't finish until you finish. So you're all kind of scattered around South London. So you never have that.
You don't feel like you're part of anything anymore. You're not connected.
So all you're doing is kind of, and you've seen from my stuff that I love a bit of kind of philosophical and existential metaphors, but it is that Sisyphus thing of just rolling the boulder up the hill. And you just, it becomes just a treadmill where you just have a totally unwinnable task. And in the meantime, what was happening in that era was all the things that made it tolerable were being chipped away as well. So like if your day off got cancelled at short notice, there was a time when that you'd get double pay for that day because there was a recognition, well, look, we've inconvenienced you there and that's your day off. Well, that went away. So then I start to think, well, because I don't actually really want to work, West Ham v Chelsea on my day off. But if it's double time, then I don't mind doing that so much. But when it just becomes,
there's no incentive.
We've cancelled your day off,
yeah.
and you can never have any say in when you get that day back. And actually, you probably won't because we're so busy. You start to think, well, hang on a minute, and you lose sight of the why I was there in the first place. And yeah, let's see, people just make it work, and that's what we see day in, day out. It's not just me.
And even something as simple as that canteen culture, you sort of wouldn't mind, I imagine, if you turned up on your day off to do something you weren't that excited about doing, but all of your colleagues, all your mates were there, and you've been called into this as well, have you? There's that sense of being together, and then you don't mind because you're part of something bigger.
And that's like the sports team. That's like the sports analogy as well, isn't it? Why do certain teams who aren't necessarily any better on paper than one of their rivals, why do they flourish and perform better and win? And often it comes down to the atmosphere and the togetherness and all that stuff. You can't just buy that or just kind of enforce that. It grows, and it develops over time.
And through shared experience, which of course you can't get when you're on your own.
And that was, and there's a lot of other things going on. We had a real, don't get me wrong, there are a lot of good leaders in policing as well. There are a lot who are seriously wanting on that level. And we had that, certainly. There was, not really that much of an interest in us as people, not much of an interest in us as how we doing, are we struggling physically, mentally? I mean, we're only talking about 6-7 years ago, but I mean, even compared to now, it was a world away in terms of sort of mental health awareness or the stigma, as you alluded to, that kind of thing. Oh, it's the riot police. Well, that does kind of tell you a little bit about it's quite a macho environment. It was, it was moving away from that, and the brilliant, empathetic people doing great stuff. But that environment is still there to turn up and show up. You're going into violent situations every day, so you don't feel like it's an environment where you can sort of put your hand up and say, actually, do you know what, I'm struggling. And when you then see that people do put their hand up and say they're struggling, only to be met with a kind of tough, you don't want it enough, then you can imagine what that does to everyone else. And certainly the straw that broke the camel's back for me was a whole group of us sort of saying, this is really not working, for not necessarily the organisation's fault itself. There's all the other stuff that goes with that, with the austerity and, just the total mismatch between supply and demand of our own resources. But when you get the response to that is, look, if you don't like it, go and work in Tesco's. And I've taken the profanity out of that bit for your podcast. But if you don't like it, go and work in Tesco's. Then you can sort of see how somebody would then look at that and go, right, so all the years I've just put into this at my own cost of sort of blood, sweat and tears, and that's what I've got, stored up in terms of recompense. And that's where, I know we're talking about physicality rather than sort of mental fitness, but
I think they're linked,
side,
Tom. I think the two are intrinsically linked. I think you can't talk about one without the other.
No, and on the emotional side, that's when people start to come into this field, which we're kind of exploring at the moment, about moral injury, which is, basically saying if somebody wants to be there and wants to do the job and wants to give it their all, but you're almost, not only are you not creating an environment conducive to that, you're almost getting in their way of doing it. And it leads to a lot of bitterness and, very kind of slow burning, but very deeply seated trauma, essentially, where people are being prevented from doing what they want to do. And up to the point where now, we have people who come to us as a business and say, I want to leave the police because I want to help people. And you think that seems fundamentally
proper oxymoron,
perverse.
Isn't it?
It doesn't make any sense, does it? But that's where we've got to in a lot of places because of this absolute, from day one, inability or lack of willingness to actually invest in creating the environment first.
All of these missing ingredients from your experience in the police, you now employ those or have employed those to create your own business, and it forms the experience and the service that you provide to the people that employ you. But when was the moment where you thought, right, or was there a moment, or was it a process where you thought, right, how can I take all of this and make it of value for me and for other people? That's a really waffly question, but I hope you kind of get the gist of it. Yeah.
No, it makes sense. I think there wasn't a moment. I think it was lots and lots of little moments that eventually there wasn't, I wish I could say, I was, a nice little kind of Instagram worthy story where I had this big eureka moment and everyone clapped overlapped and, one of those kind of things, but it wasn't. It was lots of small things that eventually came together in my head. And also it took me a long time to work that out myself. I'm talking about this stuff 7 years on, 6 years on almost with 2020 hindsight. And at the time I didn't realize a lot of that stuff. I just knew that I was, feeling pretty broken, and whatever I was doing then I couldn't do it anymore. So I didn't have, any answers. And I vividly remember the actual process of leaving. And this is a real part of it as well, because it's about identity. And, that becomes your identity when you're wearing your number on your shoulder and you've got your uniform and people know kind of who you are and what you do. And then it gets taken away from you because you're like, right, okay, you're not one of us anymore. Hand in all your kit and we'll kind of shut the gate behind you. I had done some stuff before and I wasn't there that long. So I wasn't kind of as institutionalized as a lot of people that we work with. But you are then left thinking, well, actually, what am I about now? Who am I? What can I do? And it took me a long, long time to actually have worked through my own stuff emotionally and, go and get some help with that side of it, but also to go and be in a different professional environment. And I went to work in a very corporate environment afterwards, where one of the key moments where the penny dropped was my boss in the corporate environment pulled me into his office one day and said, Tom, why haven't you spent enough of our training budget on yourself this year? And I laughed at him. I said, are you winding me up? Because I come from an environment where if you wanted to go on a training course, you would ask, but if you had to ask, you'd go through a lot of hoops, you were able to compete for it. And this was somebody saying to me, what do you want to know? How can we want to invest in you? I said to him, no, I think I'm all right, thanks. I think I've got what I need to do my job. He said, well, I don't care. What else do you want to know? What else are you interested in? And they ended up sending me on things like, sort of public speaking courses, and which wasn't a core part of my job. It was just personal development. And that's when the kind of penny dropped that I thought, it's not a charity, so why are they doing this? Not out of the kindness of their hearts. Because they're thinking, well, actually, if we don't invest in this guy and show him that we kind of want him a little bit, then he'll go to another business park on the M4 and work for one of the other competitors in the sector. And I think that's, again, the whole evolving thing around how things like the police recruit, is that traditionally there was always this mentality, and not just recruit initial new people, but how they develop and select people along the way internally. Traditionally, there's always been this mindset of, we've got the job, we've got all the power. If you want it, you'd better jump through our hoops and show us how much you want it more than the others and how you're better than the others. Whereas, most people in the rest of the world are used to a 50-50 conversation about how can we work together. It's almost a coaching conversation, let's meet each other in the middle and how can we work together and what do we actually want to achieve, rather than saying, look, I'm sitting behind the desk with all the power, you better show me you want it. So that was an even longer answer than the question, but all the things added up over time. And the point came a couple of years later where, also in the interim, all my previous colleagues have been ringing me up saying, got any jobs? How does it work? Turns out you can actually leave.
So because you'd done it, they'd found confidence in that and thought, well, maybe I can do it too.
Because those are all the people who, when I was leaving, would come up and say, nice one, mate. Yeah, thanks. But you're crazy. You can't just leave. People don't just leave. I understand now, in hindsight, that a lot of that was their own fears and their own self-doubt projecting into that. And actually, when somebody says you can't do that, it's them saying a lot of the time, I wish I could do that.
You've talked about sort of the fear of the unknown, but is that because and I'm not talking about policing in general, but general coaching perspective, people feel comfortable in their skills and abilities, but not necessarily within themselves. So if you take them out of that environment where those particular skills and abilities are at least not apparently valid anymore, it doesn't mean they're not, but they're perceived to be, then they don't have the confidence in themselves that they can apply anything good anywhere else.
Exactly that. And I think, the policing stuff is kind of an extreme example of it, because you've got, physical manifestation of your identity and your uniform, and it's all kind of very technical skills. So somebody will say, well, I'm a firearms officer of this level, and that obviously doesn't translate directly into another job in another industry. But even in the last year, we've started seeing exactly the same thing happen with, for example, airline pilots. Again, another kind of role where people grow up and when they're little kids, they want to be an airline pilot. Well, now, for the first time ever, you've got a situation where the airline industry is, really struggling. And there are a lot of people who that's all they've known, all they've wanted and how they define themselves. But now there aren't enough airline pilot jobs. So what do? And of course, if you can fly a 747, you can do any number of things, right? Because it's not actually about the flight hours and which buttons you press on. Obviously, I don't know how to fly a plane, but it's more difficult than that. But it's not about that. It's about the decision-making, the analysis, the way you talk to people, the way you go through your processes. And you hit the nail on the head, because everything we do, no matter what it's about, no matter what industry, is just saying to people, well, who are you? No one's ever asked them that. There's things like personality tests and stuff that a lot of people are familiar with now, but deeper than that, just saying, actually, what am I really about? What do I actually really do? And who am I?
And that is in bed, isn't it? Because even as you fill in, I think you mentioned earlier on a post you put recently on your LinkedIn, and even when you sign up for something like that, you put your job role, who are you? I'm a technician. Subconsciously, perhaps, identify yourselves as what you do, not as who you are.
No, exactly that. And I think because one of the things which we sort of joke about, but it's actually quite an important thing we talk about with people who are leaving the police after a long time, when they go to like a family barbecue or something, and someone says, "Oh yeah, there's Tom, he's the policeman," and everyone knows you by that term, and then all of a sudden you have to be like, "Well, I'm not anymore." There are lots of people in the police who, have got like very carefully crafted cover stories, have never said that, and everyone thinks they're a postman or something. But the ones who have always used that identity, and then one day it's not there anymore. But because I think we just like to be able to kind of put people in boxes, don't we? And it's easy to do that. Talking about the sports stuff as well, because we've started having loads of really good conversations with people in professional sport on this stuff. That happens to them as well. Somebody who you and we don't know anything about them, but we could pick a professional sports person. They're like this, and I know they're like this because I've seen like a snippet of them playing football on TV. When actually, for a basketball and like Shaquille O'Neal, massively shy, self-doubting, introverted, insecure guy, always has been. But if you just watched a few games, you'd be like, "Oh, guy's sort of superhuman, massive guy, powerful, confident." Because I'll put him in that box now, and now I know who he is.
But confidence is environmental or situational specific, isn't it? He is confident on a basketball court because he knows he's got the tools to do what he does there. But as soon as he crosses that line, that's a whole different environment, and being able to carry that confidence with you everywhere, that's a whole different kettle of biscuits.
Exactly, and professional sports people struggle with all that as well. See it loads now where people who get released, whether it's 18-year-olds getting released from football academies or 35-year-olds who've had a full career, and then you're like, okay, so all that stuff that you're famous for and known for, and that's not there anymore. So now you actually have to be left with yourself, and that's a really daunting and quite sort of terrifying prospect to have to start looking inwards and saying, well, what have I got, and is that of value? And actually believing that. And I think we also live in a society where often people with one of the loudest voices have the least to say, and once you dig beneath that, then there's a lot of people out there really doubting themselves, really thinking, well, I haven't got any value. And of course they have. It's not accepted or not promoted to go out and say, look, what I'm really good at is talking to people, listening and caring.
This is I think arguably more relevant now than it has been on such a broad scale. And clearly we've been talking about your experience in the police and the emergency services, but you've mentioned the military and you've mentioned sport, and all of these things might seem a little bit far removed from individuals that work in other environments or sectors. But this year people have experienced huge changes in their working experience. Perhaps they're working from home when they weren't before. Perhaps they're not working. Perhaps they've lost work and they're now looking for new work, or they're working but they know the work they're doing just isn't going to last long. This is, and I appreciate what you do is specialist to a degree because you work most commonly with the emergency services, but the coaching skills that you offer and the philosophies that you have embedded within your company, within Mightify, are more relevant now to to a bigger group of people than they ever have. So if you're speaking to somebody listening who hasn't been part of the emergency services, who hasn't been in the military, who hasn't played elite sport, but they are experiencing these doubts and this uncertainty and are not sure how to move forwards with what they think they've got, how would you begin the process of that coaching experience?
I think you're absolutely right. I think everyone's now in a very uncertain world, and certainly in the last 6 to 9 months we've had these kind of false start. It's really difficult because you're constantly working on shifting sands, and I think what it's had to yield for people is understanding their actual intrinsic value and what they can really do. And that's where my first challenge to people, and it almost becomes it's a difficult conversation, and it almost does become a challenge, is to say, but who are you really? It's exactly the same as when we ask people, how are you doing, and they say, yeah, I'm fine. And 9 times out of 10, that's probably not really the answer. It's just something we say, isn't it, to kind of avoid the question. And it's the same when we ask people, okay, who are you? Tell me about yourself. Well, I'm Kate, and I'm a project manager in London. So that's when I almost become like a slightly irritating 6-year-old and say, well, so what? What do you mean by that? Who are you really? And I think that's the first thing people can absolutely do. And, you don't need massive amounts of time, resources or investment to do that. You can get a piece of paper out and write down, what are your top 5 skills? And we do this, we do this with people all the time. We say to them, what are your top 5 skills? And invariably they'll start with their technical ones. They'll write, well, I'm qualified in this, that, and this, and I've got a degree in this. Okay, they're not your skills. Those are just things you've done along the way. Are you a people person? Do you solve problems? Are you empathetic? Are you resilient? All that kind of thing. Because those are actually the things you can take with you and that go anywhere. You need to know where you are right now. And then you also need to know where you want to get to. And one of the absolute crucial things we do with our clients, wherever they're coming from, is to say, what do you actually want your life to look like? Because otherwise, if you start saying, okay, it's a career change, you don't know what you don't know, and I think you talked in your previous podcast about the sort of stages of learning and, when you're kind of unconsciously incompetent, well, you don't know what else is out there. Otherwise, you go and do it. If you instead start to think, well, what do I want my week, year, month to look like? How do I want to feel? And write that down as your goal. Because having a goal that says, right, in 5 years' time, I'm going to be the director of sales at whatever company, that's the classic Mike Tyson thing. Everybody's got a plan till they get punched in the mouth. Plans don't work in a linear 5-year way like that. Plans are constantly evolving and work in short chunks and evolve. And if you know what the bigger vision is and how you actually want things to be, and you also know what you've got in your toolkit, all that remains is to actually help people to sell that. And I think, again, that's really uncomfortable, especially in the sort of public sector, but in general.
I think that's quite an important word, Tom, to cut in, that to reassure people that actually this process is uncomfortable and that it is okay to be uncomfortable, but you do have to go through it in the same way that if you desperately want to have a massive chest and set of arms, you're going to be uncomfortable. You're going to have to lift up weights that make you sore and make you hurt. There's going to be a process of being uncomfortable, but it is temporary. It is absolutely temporary, and you get better at it. That first workout hurts much more than the second one. And now as a regular exercise, you kind of, you've worked out, you feel it a bit, but you're not in that same debilitating situation that you were in the first time. But I think it's really important that people are clear on what to expect, that writing things down and talking to yourself or having other people try and poke you to ask questions, it will be uncomfortable. But unless you go through that process, and you have to be honest in the answers you provide yourself, you're not going anywhere. I use the analogy sometimes. It's a bit like being at a bus station and just getting on a bus. You're going to go somewhere, but you're not necessarily going to go where you want to go. If you want to go somewhere specifically, if you can identify the destination, then you can start looking at timetables and bus routes, and you can plan a journey and you can work out how to get there. And you're absolutely right. It might not quite go to plan. There will be lumps and bumps along the way. Maybe perhaps there'll be delays. Perhaps there'll be a replacement services. But if you've looked into, I know where I want to go, and here are the different ways I can get there, you've got a much better chance of making that happen. But it is an uncomfortable process.
Absolutely. And that's why they're called comfort zones, because they're comfortable. Comfort is a drug. Comfort is a really addictive drug.
And there's nothing wrong with comfortable either.
No,
I think sometimes we talk about one and make the other one sound like it's bad to be comfortable. You need to be uncomfortable. Well, that's not true. You need to be uncomfortable. It's bad to be comfortable. Well, that's not true either. It's called comfortable for a reason. Like, we quite like it. Like, it's a nice place to be. However, to make something else comfortable, there's going to be an uncomfortable process to get you from here to there.
Absolutely. And I think, early on in my sort of coaching work, we framed it a lot as learning to drive. You know that one day, realistically, most people, have come to, jump in a car and drive it. But we all remember that day when you first got in and thought, how is this physically possible to actually, do this? And your parents or whoever was sitting next to you is kind of tearing their hair out because they're thinking, well, this is obvious. Why can't you just do this like everyone else can? But in time, like you say, by pushing yourself and learning and practicing, there comes a point where you're in that comfort zone. And driving's probably a good example, like you say, of, I'm generally comfortable that I know how to drive a car now, and I don't really feel like I need to become Formula One world champion. I'm quite comfortable. But there are other things where I know that actually I'm comfortable and I want to challenge myself and push. And I think, if you know that you're doing it for the right thing, and again, maybe that ties into the point about the motivation. And one of the things we come across a lot is people saying, I know that I'm unhappy and I know that I don't want to be here, but, should I just kind of stick at it and put up with it? And I always say to them, obviously, well, no, I don't think that, because I think life's too short for that. But you also need something that excites you enough or motivates you enough, somehow infuses you enough to go through that discomfort. Because like you say, in a gym context, why do people, turn up at 6 a.m. doing heavy squats, which is not a pleasant experience? They wouldn't actually love it. But why do they do that? Because they feel that the outcome is worth it and justifies it. And that's why it's really crucial to work backwards from the end goal of knowing, well, what do you actually want to get from this? There's no point, signing up to a in career change terms, there's no point signing up to a 3-year degree in veterinary medicine if you've got no interest in being a vet. Then you'll just be really uncomfortable for no positive benefit to you. So we always encourage people to look at the end goal and work backwards, because that can give you not only the vision, but also that continued motivation to get going and to keep going. Because I'm sure you're the same as me, that when you start a business, for example, you might have a vision of where it's going to be, but I'd say it very, very rarely ends up anywhere near that. You know, all kinds of things happen and you learn along the way. But if you keep pushing forward, you almost can't fail.
I don't know if I'm going to butcher this this phrase. Is it the best plans are made in wet cement, not concrete? Part of me's got doubt there, because ultimately wet cement will become concrete. But I think the point, hopefully,
that's getting very kind of Confucian, sort of ancient. We're getting very abstract with wet cement will always become concrete. That sounds like it should be some sort of ancient quote.
I know that sort of stuff goes on in my head all the time. Every time I open my mouth, that's why I waffle so much, I think. Listen, I think we've given, or I hope we've given people things that they can definitely do themselves, which is brilliant. Because I think, a couple of times you've brought up concepts of personal responsibility. We have to embrace that if we are to be better for ourselves, better for our families, better for our communities. Whatever level you want to measure that at, personal responsibility will underpin it. However, it is not a coincidence that the world's best, they have coaches. This is now what you do. You operate as a coach, supporting people, specifically, I don't think uniquely, but specifically emergency services, in looking at what they have got and how it can be applied elsewhere to give them purpose in life and give them meaningful pursuits, targets, goals and opportunities. Tell us a little bit more about how your coaching role has evolved, and maybe some of the processes that or some of the benefits that someone could enjoy from having a coach that does this for a living.
I think you're absolutely right on that first point, just that you've got to walk through the door, whether it's a personal trainer in the gym, whether it's coaching in any context, that a big part of our work is advocating for the environment, as we were talking about earlier in the piece, and I go and knock on those doors and try and encourage organizations to create that environment. But at the same time, you can have the best personal trainer in the world, but if you don't do the reps, then you ain't going to see the results. So how my sort of coaching stuff evolved was I began to identify that actually what motivated me, and like you said, this is all about fulfillment and purpose, and mine was actually helping people. And that's probably what I enjoyed about policing. I'd always kind of toyed with the idea of being a teacher. I never really got around to it, so that had been there as well. I think it just grew from that. And because I was so interested in the bits that had been missing from my own experience around the fitness and health and mindset and mental health, just to kind of formalize my own interest in that. And I think I sort of see that as a bit of a proving ground, really, because I think if you can take somebody, kind of walks in the gym off the street with a kind of vaguely defined fitness goal and, get them some objectives, then you've probably got some kind of coaching skill set in there. That was where it started, really. And then what do you talk about when you're PTing somebody in between sets and reps? Everything else that's going on with their life. So I got really interested in that. And I just found that actually I was really interested in the whole picture. What actually drives people? Why do people get stuck and sort of so unaware of their own value? And can we unlock that? And I've always been a geek on the psychology side and sports psychology, and I must have read the Phil Jackson book 11 Rings about 100 times, and probably watched The Last Dance about 20 already, so and all that stuff, because actually it was about all the stuff that went on behind the scenes and the coaching, and the fact that they were doing that in professional basketball in late 80s, early 90s to begin with, when very, very different environment, just showed actually with the right kind of inputs and interventions, you can create an environment where everybody thrives in their own best way and the team wins too. And I think that's the core of what we're trying to do. So some of the stuff we can do with people is really fundamentally based around helping them see what they're already capable of. And I think I'm really passionate about that in coaching, that none of this is about saying that you're broken and you need fixing, because I don't think anyone does. I think it's just there are things happening that are stopping you being happy, fulfilled, or getting to where you want to get to. And we can take some of those barriers away. Some of them are self-created, some of them might be external.
Do you think as well that the bit maybe you've missed, like, yes, you can take them away, but you can see them sometimes in others where they can't see it themselves, where through experience, but also because you are on the outside, you are an objective observer, that you can listen to someone, meet someone, and you can see where those barriers are and help them identify them, and they wouldn't have noticed them otherwise.
100%. And I think actually, one of the things that I find, really motivates me in the work we do, but also I find quite sad sometimes is people are so unaware of their value so often. And just to use one very quick recent example, I was working with a chap on his career change, and he said, "Oh, I forgot to mention to you, I've been a RNLI lifeboat captain for about 14 years, but I suppose that's not really relevant."
Wow.
And I said, "I'd hire you tomorrow, because what does that tell me about you?" And that's exactly what you just said. But to me, I'm sort of open mouthed thinking, that's incredible. And that's already telling me so many things about you as a person that I would want in any business. It's as simple as us saying, hang on a minute, why don't you think that's impressive? What is that really about? And just being that mirror and that challenge. And I think that's the coaching skill set as a whole is some people need that. That just, it's all there and they just need to be kind of have it reflected back to them like a mirror and to realize it. Some people, it's a bit more kind of deeply hidden and it needs to be drawn out and developed. And I always like to sort of say that we're not creating or suddenly building new people. All we're doing is kind of, we're finding the diamonds and just kind of polishing them up a bit or putting them in the shop window. All this stuff's already there. All these people are already valuable, whole, incredible people. They just maybe don't realize it for some reason or don't quite know.
I do wonder if it is a personality trait or type, the type of person who is truly quite wonderful as your boat captain. I was going to get the initials wrong there, are the RLNI. Is it that it just happens that type of person doesn't see what they do as valued? Like they just don't. They do it because it's that sense of personal responsibility, but are not able, and I've heard you use this phrase before, they're not able to suspend their humility for long enough to say, actually, what I do is quite important. I can fulfill other roles because of this.
Exactly that. Humility is a absolutely lovely human quality to have, and we'd probably be in a better position in the world all round if there were a lot more humble people around. But there comes a time when there's no point being the sort of world's best kept secret at what you do.
Yeah.
Especially if that's then starting to harm you because you're feeling actually under the surface undervalued or kind of put upon. And I think that happens in a real thread of the people we work with, and they say, yeah, but I don't want to blow my own trumpet. Well, you're going to have to, because I'm afraid that's what job interviews are all about. They are an hour-long trumpet blowing session. You're right. And I think it doesn't mean you have to suddenly become somebody you're not or become arrogant or anything like that. It just means actually step into what you can do.
Because everyone does have a trumpet, right?
Of course.
And everyone has got a tune they can play on it.
Yeah, exactly. You just need to, and sometimes it's just you're playing your tune, the right tune to the wrong audience. I think we've all been there. Where you're in a particular role and you think, like, I'm actually really good, just not at this. Or someone just can't see it, and that's fine. And that's the other thing, that comes up a lot in our work is that people really struggle with that moral. Again, it's almost that moral injury piece because they're working in a vocation and they think, look, I've given 15 years of my life. Walking away now would be walking away or quitting or giving up, and it's not. How many people in the world have never given 15 years to it? It's something to be massively proud of, and you're just looking for a new chapter and you're moving on. You take all the great stuff with you. But I think sometimes we also are kind of emotionally attached to that for understandable reasons and think, I don't really want to leave because this is what I know, even if it's harmful. And I think that was where I very first got into being so passionate about coaching, was I was just seeing people staying places that they knew deep down were hurting them physically, emotionally, however. And they knew there was something better out there. They just didn't know what it looked like. That's where we really come in, and that's what we do. We work with people one-to-one. We run courses for organizations. We can do all the practical stuff around careers. Fundamentally, it's often giving people permission, because it's very hard sometimes to give yourself permission to move on from that and say, okay, but I'm down this road now. It would be some kind of failure to turn around or to take a different detour. Whereas actually, sometimes you need to get on the path before like you said, if you could stand in Waterloo Station for hours looking at all the trains that are cancelled and thinking, I won't get on that one, I won't get on that one. And I've done that plenty of times on South West trains myself. There comes a point where you have to go, right, I'll get as far as Basingstoke and then I'll see if I can get where I can get from there. It's a very kind of clumsy metaphor, but otherwise you can spend your whole life standing in Waterloo Station looking up at the boards and thinking, I'm never going to get anywhere. A big part of our job is saying to people, it's okay to start and it's okay to try and it's okay to do something different.
Different's a really nice word. And I think one that's not embraced enough. We're very keen to choose good, bad, right, wrong, better, worse. We like to do that. We're not very good at just saying, well, it's different. There's nothing wrong with different. Like I did this and now I'm going to do something else and it's different. Not better, worse, right, none of those things. It's different. It might be a better fit than it was. That's okay to evaluate on that level, but different in and of itself just means different.
Exactly. And I think, one of the things I say to people really regularly is they'll say to me, okay, yeah, I could do that. Yeah. But what if it doesn't work out? And I'll say, well, do something else.
Yeah.
And that, it feels like, and I know there was a time when if someone said to me, I'd have been, sort of cursing under my breath and thinking, oh, right, yeah, whatever, mate. But it's true, and that's life. Sometimes things go really well, sometimes they don't. And when they don't, you do something else. And that's all there is to it, really, But like you say, different has to be bad. Well, actually, no, not at all. Because if you already know where you are is not working, then what have you got to lose?
Not much. I think we've talked about some nice stuff. I really appreciate you giving up the time to have this conversation with us today. It's lovely to learn a little bit more about you and about your past and your experiences, both before, during and after serving in the police. And I think that people have got some nice stuff to take away with them. If you had like maybe a bullet point 1, 2, 3 of things that someone, whether it be work related, regardless of the context, get into a new relationship, a new line of work, a new sports team, a new habit, new hobby, whatever. And I appreciate I've just put that on you, but do you have a process that might be able to map to them on a general level, a 1, 2, 3 things they might do?
I think the first thing I would say is forget where you are now and focus on where you want to be, and get a piece of paper out or write a note in your phone, however you operate, and just imagine, what do you want that to feel like or look like? Even if it's just a point of writing down a day, your ideal day. What would your ideal day be? Because if you can work that bit out, you can work backwards. And okay, you might not quite get the same thing. That person who's there with you might not be Scarlett Johansson or Tom Hardy or whoever, who's the next best option. Take the time and dream and just write that down wherever you want to write it down, in a journal, on a piece of paper, in your phone, and then just allow yourself to kind of sit with that for a little bit and read it a few times and say, actually, yeah, that would make me feel really good. That's the first stage you can do. Everything from there is about steps. And you said it yourself, go on and keep moving forward with single step. Journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. But as long as you know what you're aiming for, we can work the rest of the steps out. Everyone can do that. Where do I actually want to get to? What does that look like? What does it feel like? Because if you write it down, if you speak it, you bring it into existence. And that sounds a bit kind of out there.
No, it doesn't. I mean, you are explaining the exact same process that I might use with a client or a student. We're identifying or establishing the goal. Like, where do I want to go? Where do I want to be?
Absolutely.
And I like the idea of thinking about it as well. Like, is that actually where I want to be? And then acknowledging where you are and identifying the steps that how do I get from here to there, and then make a list and off you go, one step at a time.
We try and publish lots of success stories as often as we can to show you that, it's not for other people as well. That's the other thing. Sometimes people are like, oh yeah, that's for other people though. No, success is for you, and it's not just something other people do.
I'll tell you what I really like. I think we'll finish on this actually. And you've said it a few times. You said, write it down. Yep. And even though actually once, I think you said open an app on your phone. And that's okay. But what's great about writing it down is that you physically will still see it. So if you put it in a book or you chuck it on a Post-it note and it's on the fridge, you will physically see it, as opposed to it being maybe on an app or a file on your computer where you may never open that again. I really like that idea of going a little bit old school, pen, paper, write it down. I think there probably is some value in the physical act of writing it down as well. But the outcome of having it written down is that it's now, there it is. I like that.
And the even better bit about writing it down on pen and paper is that when it comes to the day when you achieve it, you can cross it off.
Yeah, that's really nice. Yeah, that's really lovely. Oh well, look, that's got to be the note we end on. Then really grateful for you for giving us your time today, and I wish you every success for 2021 and beyond.
No, thanks, mate. Likewise, appreciate it.
Weapons activated. Goodbye.